U.S. Policy in Central America under Biden, hosted by the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Arizona. I'm Liz Oglesby, and I am the co-chair of the center's colloquial series. And I'd like to thank the center staff for their support, and of course, our two speakers today for their time and their insight. Just a couple of logistical requests. If everyone could please remember to keep your microphones mute, and also please turn off your cameras during the formal part of this panel. And then if you wish, you can turn your cameras back on during the Q&A. So thanks very much, everyone, except for our two speakers. Thank you for turning off your cameras. Okay, so I wanted to mention that today's panel is the second of a two-part series on migration at the southern border. These events are supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education in support of teaching and engagement activities around Central America. So for all the students who are attending today, we wanted to just let you know that we are offering a new certificate in Central American Studies, as well as scholarships, and we'd love to have you participate in this new initiative. If you go to the chat, you can download this flyer with the contact information for more information about the certificate. Also, I wanted to mention that we are offering foreign language and area studies fellowships for Mayan language study this summer. And this is for undergraduate or graduate students. This flyer is also in the chat for students. So you're welcome to download it, and we would love to have you participate in that as well. So thank you. Okay, so today's panel focuses on the Biden plan for Central America and what the administration is proposing to address as the root causes of migration from the region. And this is an important conversation for us here in Southern Arizona. Many people in this region have been involved with Central America for many years, since the sanctuary and solidarity movements of the 1980s. I know Isla Abernathy, I think she's here, with allies from the Guatemala Solidarity Project, and other groups are here as well, attending today. So thank you. And many in our region are involved in border-related activism and humanitarian work. This panel hopes to reanimate the conversation about how this border activism join hands with Central American human rights activism, how to advocate so that US policy can support real alternatives in the region, and how to amplify the demands of Central American grassroots and community leaders, civil society sectors, and human rights and environmental defenders. And so we have with us today two leading advocates and analysts who work in this effort. Adriana Beltrán is the director of the Citizen Security Program at the Washington Office on Latin America, where she focuses on violence prevention, police and judicial reform in Central America, and analyses of human rights and organized crime. She's the co-author of the seminal study, Hidden Powers, which documents the rise and impact of clandestine criminal organizations in Guatemala following the 1996 peace accords. And we have put a link to that document in the chat for anyone who wishes to download it. Claudia Samayoa is one of Guatemala's leading human rights analysts and defenders. She founded the Human Rights Defenders Protection Unit in Guatemala, and she's been involved in many advocacy and research initiatives around issues of organized crime, anti-corruption, impunity and accountability, and human rights in the region. So thank you both. We're so honored and privileged to have you here with us today. Our format will be to have each speaker give short remarks and then generate a bit of conversation between the panelists, and then we'll open it up for audience participation. Because we are a large group, we're going to invite you to put your questions in chat. And as I mentioned, we are recording. So thank you to everyone. And Adriana, I invite you to begin.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the university and to Liz for the invitation. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here with Claudia, who I haven't seen in quite a long time due to the situation. As Liz mentioned, I work for the Washington Office on Latin America. We are a research and advocacy organization based here in DC that promotes human rights and the rule of law in the Americas. And I focus mostly on Central America. Just to be brief, here and in the region, there's a lot of optimism with the Biden administration and opportunities that might bring to have a shift in what has been U.S. policy toward the region. Primarily, Biden as vice president traveled to the region and knows the region well. But I would like to start by saying that much has changed in Central America from the time that he was vice president. And unfortunately, not for the better. Conditions in the region have deteriorated significantly. This, I would say, that has in large part due to nefarious non-state actors in corrupt networks, in some cases that I would describe as kleptocratic states. And even though, we had seen important progress in tackling impunity and corruption in the region to varying degrees, we are started to see a very profound backsliding in this area. This not only included the closure of very important and successful, effective international anti-impunity mechanisms. In the case of Guatemala with CICIG, in the case of Honduras, there was an OAS-led mission, anti-impunity mission known as MOXIE, but it has also included the passage of laws in the various countries that essentially aim to protect politicians, legislatures from being investigated. It includes reforms that have lower sentences for corruption-related crimes. It has included attacks against independent judges and prosecutors. We've also seen a rise in criminalization of civil society. And I'm not sure if Claudia can talk more about this, but we've seen the rise in malicious lawsuits, campaigns aimed to discredit their work, but also seeing the passage of bills or attempt to pass laws that limit people's right to protest, that limit the work of civil society, and you've seen a rise in attacks. As part of my work, we do have a project called the Central America Monitor, and I was shocked to see that, in Honduras, for example, within a 4-year period, we had registered the killing of 141 human rights defenders in Honduras alone. We've seen a rise in actions to silence the independent media. And here I would underscore or highlight the case of El Salvador, where we are starting to see a worrisome increase in harassment and attacks against the independent press, and also the use of state institutions to go after them. We're seeing efforts to influence or gain control of the justice system. This is the case right now in Guatemala, where we're starting, they're in the process of electing the Constitutional Court, the highest court, and there is grave concern that these corrupt networks are trying to influence that process. And we've seen a rise in autocratic governments and challenges to democratic institutions. This has included a rise and continued use of force by police and military and the militaries, and the closing of civic space. Added to this is the impact of the pandemic and back-to-back hurricanes that cause massive destruction and devastation of the country. And these are all, different factors that create outward migration from the region. Obviously, these are long-term challenges, but I would say that, they were made worse by the Trump presidency. What we saw was that with the overwhelming focus on migration, the America First policy, cuts in assistance, and the style of the Trump administration, that it took attention away from other areas, including support for rule of law and governance issues. That preference to back, I would say, corrupt governments in exchange for support for deterrent migration and the impact that had in the region. Now, Biden, as was mentioned, has promised a new approach to the region to undo many of the migration policies of the previous administration. I would say that one of the few plans that were presented on the Western Hemisphere by the campaign focused on Central America. And broadly, it looked at renewing focus on addressing what are known as the drivers of migration. So looking at issues of governance, security, and economic opportunity, and of expanding the asylum system and the capacity to apply for protection in country. Just yesterday, the administration made good on its campaign promise and introduced a comprehensive immigration bill, one in the House and one in the Senate. I'm not going to go through all the details, but just to focus on the Central America part, because it does include a piece that looks at addressing these drivers of migration, including $4 billion for a 4-year plan that looks at strengthening governance and rule of law, tackling impunity, issues related to the independence of the judiciary, protection for human rights, addressing poverty and inequality, and issues related to gender-based violence, sexual and domestic violence. And it does make mention of consultation with civil society, both here in the US and in the region, and conditions aid on the government's making progress. Now, overall, from what we see, it's a good bill. It's a good framework, but as I always say, the devil's in the details. And the Biden administration does have to present a detailed strategy to Congress by June. And here is where I like to highlight a few of the issues or points that we've been making on the part of WOLA. And one is, as I started off, conditions are different right now in Central America. And so we cannot have more of the same. We cannot go back and replicate what has been done before. Not to say that there weren't initiatives that worked and that were effective, but we cannot simply hit, reset. As there are immense challenges in the region right now that we need to address. Two, I would say that priority needs to be on addressing issues of governance and rule of law. As I have started off, it's become more and more apparent that in these countries, you're dealing with a very small but very powerful network of political and economic elites and criminals that are running the government and that are using the state coffers to line their pockets at the expense of the populations. It is these networks that have resisted reform and change. This was the conclusions that were reached by a recent report by the Woodrow Wilson Center. And so in order to make progress in other areas, I would say that priority needs to be on addressing this key issue. Third, I want to say is, significant support needs to be targeted to civil society and independent media. In the last several years, they have been the main counterweight to government corruption, often at great risk. And we need to increase support for civil society, but also address issues of protection. This includes the issue of civil society consultation, which I'm great it's included in the bill, but it needs to be regular and it needs to be meaningful. And it needs to ensure that the voices of those in the rural areas, of indigenous communities, of Afro-descendant communities are heard, particularly as you start looking at the economic piece of the proposal. Fifth, I'd like to say, these are long-term challenges. And they're going to require a long-term sustainable approach that is going to extend well beyond the next 4 years. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Six, for me, this is not just a question of aid, but a lot of these challenges require political solutions. And therefore, the efforts of the administration need to be aligned, meaning that the diplomatic efforts and assistance need to work hand in hand. There are actions that the administration needs to take to ensure that they're not showing support or appear to be showing support for corrupt governments. They need to use a good carrot and stick approach and use all the tools that they have at their disposal to send a very clear message. And lastly, I would say that the sustainability of of these efforts depends on the political will of the governments. And right now, frankly, it's not there. I would say that none of the three governments represents an optimal partner. This is not to say that political will, cannot be built. It's not, definitely not static. But I think it is an issue that it's worth keeping in mind, because in order to achieve long-term progress, long-term structural reforms, it will require the commitment of the governments in the region. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Claudia, we invite you now to continue.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm so glad to see how much people have joined. And talking after Adriana is always tough because she also talks so fast and give me this idea that I'm back in the Congress and Senate trying to explain advisors what's about Guatemala and the region. And so she did such a great job, but maybe I will try to change the focus. A couple of weeks ago, a couple of cars appeared incinerated with 19 migrants in Tamaulipas, Mexico. One of those migrants was Edgar Lopez y Lopez, who had fled Guatemala during wartime in 1990 and settled in Jackson, Mississippi in 1993 and got married, had 2 kids. And when this mass deportation happened in the factories, I was thinking, well, not factories, but with this food plants, he was one of the people deportees. Well, he actually was in prison 11 months in the border, and finally was deported to Guatemala. He stayed here for a couple of months. He was very religious. He decided to, instead of building a new home in Guatemala with a house with a big structure, he supported building the church of his township. A beautiful church, is big. He decided that because of travel restrictions and the fact that he was illegal in the United States, he decided to go back to his wife and daughters. So he hired one of these trafficking networks, and the police of Tamaulipas, of this township called Camargo, asked for the payment, and they didn't have it. So they killed Edgar and 18 other migrants. That's the reality that we need to address. It's very human. It's a lot of history, stories, and it's the fallout of the vicious policy during Trump era. It won't go away because there's an announcement of a change of policy. It will take time, and it will take lives. And like this story, there's a lot of stories with different levels of violence. And so that means that if Biden's proposal that's also contained in this bipartisan bill that I always underline, Central American policy has been bipartisan. And it could remain bipartisan if the likes of Ted Cruz can be controlled. Well, that's your issue. But for our issue, it has been how far Trump administration allowed the powers, the hidden powers described in Adriana's book, now very open and cynical, to move forward. And that's what I wanted to talk to you. What had happened in our region during the last years after Obama's administration is an alliance between the extreme right wing in the United States and the extreme right wing in our countries that is also the space where organized crime and corruption dwells. And the result has been that during the last 4 years, they not only got this international commission out, but they also managed to create this authoritarian, kleptocratic, and insular government. So, for instance, in the case of Honduras, where we have this very grave deterioration of human rights, that is significant by the number of human rights activists killed in the last years. What we have is a narco government. The head of state, the president, is a narco trafficker. There's a couple of cases open against him, indictments against him. Several members of his closest circle are either in jail or they have extradition processes, but nothing happens. And in Honduras, we saw how they tried to burn the door of the embassy, and nothing happened. So somehow during the Trump government, even though we have this bipartisan, very anti-corruption, anti-organized crime, pro-democracy bills that have been building up during the last decades, there was this sense that they could get away with it. And it's so high that even though there has been a change of administration, and I can talk by Guatemala, the way the embassy and the Secretary of State has addressed the situation in Guatemala has never been as clear as now. I think it's clearer than in times of Obama. That was one of the questions posed, how much it has changed. Even though it's still promises, we can see that they are ramping up a clear message that Guatemala has to change path. The answer has been more isolation. A Congress that is not meeting with diplomats, an international foreign relationship minister that is saying ambassadors should not talk to anybody but us. And that is creating and closing the space for this kind of consultation with civil society. Just a week ago, or no, 2 weeks ago, United States Embassy and 12 other international, either embassy office or institutions, openly called for an election of constitutional court members that is transparent and elect people without any link with any kind of criminal behavior. They actually almost named the situation of one delinquent that was named to be part of the constitutional court, but it was stopped by legal artiluges by our part. But it's kind of the only way to stop this kind of people to get into the constitutional court. So the reaction was something I had never seen in Guatemala, but it represents how callous these three governments are towards United States. They asked for a meeting with the State Department, and one of the messages they wanted to give is sorry, we have the Vienna Convention that norms our international relations, and you shouldn't meddle around internal policy. I think that the reaction of the State Department is very clear, and there's this kind of low-key trying to get some kind of sovereignty plea. But our fear is that even though we have the strongest position by the United States, a bit political for now, there is no answer by the government. So what Adriana says, it really reflects the main human rights issue in our countries. And it's the fact that 4 years ago, we had governments that tried to present themselves as democratic and human rights obeying governments. Now the governments do not have any problem on committing human rights abuses in front of the world and going by the world, just saying that's how we deal with the problems. We are not seeing this only in Central America. The coup d'etat in Myanmar might be another sign of this kind of changes of the winds. But we saw El Salvador president parading photos of the prisoners of the couple of gangs, almost nude, in the middle of the pandemic first presentation in our country. I'm sorry, my English is not coming very good now. But what we are seeing is that, as having the very near example of Nicaragua with an autocratic totalitarian government, our governments are doing just the same. For instance, we had 3 days ago a big campaign that was called by some anonymous women that said, "Tengo miedo," I have fear. And the idea was to share our feelings of having fear of going outside after the killings, very gross killings of 3 minors, children, 9, 8 years old girls that were kidnapped in front of the houses and appeared in very gross condition, but also the killing of women that has been the highest number in all the register during these weeks, in this first month. So it was this campaign to say we have fear, but it was not an immobilizing campaign. It was like empowering women and men to address the issue of security. As a reaction, the president has ordered the firing of every woman that had participated in this campaign. And we learned this because the pressure was so high against the campaign by the part of the government, like saying, you don't talk about fear. We are very courageous people. We are not fearful. So the way, let us address the very grave issue of women's and violence. And they found out who proposed the campaign. And it happened that one of these persons used to work in CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity. And so the basis to fire her and all the people that participated in the campaign is that the fact that she worked with CICIG 3-4 years ago demonstrates that the left was trying to impose the agenda. This is the same government that annulled the inscription of Planned Parenthood, that was an associate of the United States aid to address sexual and reproductive rights of women in Guatemala. Nothing about abortion. It was just basically basic sexual health. And they were coming in to support USAID. So we have been seeing this going on. And one of the main, we have 3 main objectives of this totalitarian rule. One of them, and one of the most effective one, has been the anti-gender, that's how they call themselves, anti-gender agenda. What does this mean? This means that they want to go back in all the women rights advancements and the LGBTIQ advancement, to go back to the good, nice ways of the past where women obeyed men. And this means impunity for violence against women, which has been one of the biggest promoters of migration of women and the children to protect themselves from the aggressive husband, ex-husband, boyfriend, and the gangs, especially in the case of Honduras, where women are targeted by gangs in a very big way. And so we have women. The other group that's under attack is social activists. We are so-called the left communist threat against our democracies, and that's how they charge, for instance, El Faro in El Salvador, or several journalists in Guatemala, including Michelle Mendoza, that is the CNN reporter in Guatemala. I always find it fun when they say that CNN is communist, but well, I saw it with your last president. So this is one of the other groups. Any group that might criticize, might want transparency, are considering left wing, and they want to destroy that. In Guatemala, the government already have annulled all the institutionality that was created for peace and human rights. This is the scenario that then creates the need for migration, because there is no attention for hunger. During the pandemic, we have increased in a 20% the number of people severely malnourished in the country. And we are one of the the 4 countries in the world with the biggest number of malnutrition in children under the age of 5. So this means a lot. So we have to migrate, especially men migrate a lot, to give food to the kids that they will never see again, because they are trapped between the need to have money and the possibility of coming out of the United States, because then they will have to go back in this way. So we have to address this issue. That is the issue of poverty. But if we don't support human rights activists, development workers, people that are trying to get the local governments to be more transparent, to confront the narco trafficker in their communities, it will be impossible to work on development. It will not happen. It doesn't happen unless you consider that the money that organized crime gives community, and that the community invests in some buildings for the education and health, it's development. I think that organized crime is actively supporting some communities to have better conditions, but I wouldn't call that development. And human rights activists are key to addressing both corruption in the government, organized crime, territory growth, and channeling development. And when I call civil rights organizations, I will actually try to mention the growing organizations based in indigenous local authority practices, old practices, is what we call indigenous authorities or indigenous guide. That has also meant that we have more indigenous authorities, leaders, women that are leaders in their community being killed as part of this reaction against anything that is social movement. And the other group is this, what already Adriana talked about, is the criminalization of lawyers, judges, prosecutors, Supreme Court or Constitutional Court magistrates, or judges, as you call it in English. This criminalization is specifically against those that apply the law and try to find justice either for crimes of the past, corruption cases, organized crime corruption cases that are linked, or human rights cases of the present. I have a case of a judge that has 70 lawsuits against that judge, just one judge. And I would say the human rights activists that have had more cases against them that we have registered is an indigenous leader that had 8 cases. And one might say, well, but judges have more tools to confront these cases. No, they have the same vulnerabilities and the same lack of abilities to confront criminalization as the indigenous leader, because criminalization is the power of the state. And I know this is Northern Triangle, but I want to refer on how this relates with Nicaragua and Nicaragua's recent laws to criminalize posting in Twitter, legal possibilities of organized. And all these new laws started 10, 12 years ago with the suppression of independence of the justice system. And this is not only presented in the case of criminalizations of independent judges, which Guatemala is the only country I know by now that has this terrible numbers, but also by the fact that we haven't had the new Supreme Court magistrates or judges named, and they should have been named in 2019. And for now, I don't see that there is any interest in naming the new Supreme Court. Why? Because this one allows them to go with impunity, allows them to criminalize the judges that are trying to bring forth cases. So if we don't address these human rights realities, not only from the part of Biden, because I don't think that the government of Biden will be able to make true the promises they had made or that the Congress had made through the bill, without active civil society engagement and understanding that there are some little key valves that we have to move. I have named the 3 of them to be able to move forward on an anti-poverty bill or a pandemic relief action that in Guatemala, because of corruption, is so far away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. We have a question that I think is a good segue from how you ended, Claudia. Both of you mentioned civil society engagement, especially the consultations that US policy under Biden says it wants to initiate with civil society groups. And so the question is if maybe both of you, Adriana and Claudia, could speak a bit about what civil society consultation might look like, perhaps particularly with respect to rural, indigenous, and Black voices. And then also specifically, how can allies in the United States support that process in Central America of civil society consultations? Thanks. And I invite members of the public, if you would like to put other questions in the chat, and we will take them.
¿Quieres que vaya yo?
Dale tú y después voy yo.
Okay. That's a great question. Civil society consultations can take many forms, and sometimes they mention civil society consultations, and it ends up being a box that they tick. And that's what we need to avoid. And that's where the efforts of movements here, organizations here can play a critical role in really ensuring that we have a meaningful consultation process. And by meaningful, I mean particularly pressing the administration to do consultations at the local level. They often do, at least in the past, under the Obama administrations, did consultations here in DC, with organizations that work in the region. But for me, the key is how can we press the administration to establish a process, a regular process, to do consultations on the ground. And that means not just inviting a few organizations that they tend to work with or that they have traditionally supported, but ensuring that you have a broad range of civil society organizations that participate in that, that can share their own perspectives, their own recommendations, even if that may not be what they want to hear. And that ensures that the voices of those in the interior of the country are heard. I think that's where a lot of consultation processes falter because they tend to be focused, even if they do in country, in the capitals. And there is no process to gather information, to gather the perspectives, the input of those that work or live in the interior, to ensure that the voices of indigenous communities, of Afro descendants and others are heard and are taken into account. And this should be a regular process. It shouldn't be, you know, let me tick the box, but should be a regular process that informs both the strategy, but also evaluation of US assistance and efforts on the ground.
Thank you. Adriana, are you able to turn on your video?
Sorry, I forgot. You would think by now I would have,
No,
have this down.
don't worry. We love your kids. So I wanted to address this, and it's the question of what is local. Because this has been a discussion. I know Adriana has heard this many times. We have been in the queue. We asked for consultation. We asked for dialogue. I remember in the time of Obama with this Plan de Progreso. I don't even remember the name of this policy. Anyway, when we discuss consultation, local consultation for the embassies or for USAID or for this process is organizations, and not even organization, is companies, entrepreneurs, which would be great if they were what we call local entrepreneurs, but it's basically the biggest corporations in the country is which they consult. And some NGOs, and specifically, and that's a problem, they used to they consult those NGOs that USA give money to. So a lot of NGOs that might not be like the FEGUA receiving money from United States government or United States programs might be left out. The other problem is that they tend to consult like, oh, you are a children issue, a child issue. We will consult you about accompanied child migration. But they don't see these organizations also being able to talk about development, for instance, or health issues. So there's also this very focalized and therefore not a big consultation. Having said that, I have always recognized that embassies have legal possibility, don't have that much money. But because of the key and strategical role that the Northern Triangle plays now for United States, and that's another condition that has changed. 10 years ago, we were trying to explain why Guatemala was important. Even 10, it was 20 years ago. Oh my God. It was 20 years ago that we were trying to explain, you know, Guatemala is important because we are in the backyard, and we were trying to explain this. Now it's very evident why we were important. So there has to be investment, and the investment has to be on if to identify which is the territory communities that we have to consult. And in the cases of Guatemala and Honduras that have big indigenous Afro-Caribbean or Black communities, there's an obligation to use in our local legal format, consult indigenous people. So the government has to learn to do this. So that's a very important step, and that's something that we need you to also help. And in this sense, we have to remember there's a lot of migrants that come from specific communities. And for instance, you that are from Arizona, you know, Guatemalan communities. Some of them are indigenous communities because they trend. We all know that they go by groups. They can be the link, and I have always say the link for these consultations are the migrants that are already there in the United States. They can explain and they can support the linkages, and then at the national level we can also help. There's a question I will already just respond very quickly. Actually, you can find a tweet by myself rejoicing that the United States has rejoined the UN Human Rights Council, which is great. Does that mean that the United States will be serious about human rights in Mexico and Central America? I don't know. That's to be seen. I heard today Biden's communique or speech in the G7, and he said United States relationship with the world is not going to be transactional or extractive. And I laughed to myself. And I cannot see Biden's administration changing a transactional and extractive relationship with us. So this will be a path forward very difficult in the region. But of course, it's better to have a United States that talk about human rights that United States that talks about nationalism and sovereignty and the end of multilateralism.
Thank you. So we do have a couple more questions in the chat. I guess there's one question maybe to Adriana about, who in the administration is a good point to lobby about this question of consultation. So if people in the United States want to support the efforts in the region that Claudia is talking about, who is in charge of that administration, and how can US allies best lobby for that kind of broad consultation? And then there's another question which Claudia just alluded to, which is about foreign investment and the fact that this often happens, in a parallel way. So there's Biden's aid program, but then there's US direct foreign investment, which is often extractive and exacerbates the very conditions that the aid programs are trying to mitigate. So I'm wondering if either one of you could comment on that question as well. Thank you.
Sure. So to the first question, I would say that usually the State Department is the one that establishes consultation processes, or has in the past. AID can also do it, but I would say here that members of Congress can also press the administration and make this a point or a priority in their conversations with the administration. So even, reaching out to your member of Congress, senator, and putting this on the agenda and why this is important. Similarly, and this goes to another question about how can you support ensuring, a focus on the issues that we've addressed. There's a lot that can be done through Congress, particularly as the administration is developing a strategy to ensure that, in discussions around the immigration bill, that the focus on addressing these challenges and the key challenges in the region are addressed. And by that, I mean the structural reforms that are needed and what role the administration can play in trying to address these kleptocratic, illicit criminal networks that have taken control of these states and are the ones that are impeding meaningful progress. And to something that Claudia mentioned, the bipartisanship. This is an issue in general that has received bipartisan support, but I think it's still important to, press and encourage that we focus on, prioritize the right issues in order to see some level of progress, at least in the next 4 years. Because there's often, a debate about whether you prioritize security or other issues. And I do think that the focus needs to be on this governance impunity piece in order to see progress in other areas, as Claudia mentioned. And with the other issues, this is something that we are actually raising with Congress right now, because there are, we have for a number of years worked on establishing certain conditions around foreign assistance. But when I talk about, the whole of government being aligned, it means that, loans or other support that is given through multilateral entities must also move in the same direction. And that means that you need to also ensure that there are mechanisms in place to avoid any kind of support that results in, in these damages that we've discussed, but also doesn't support or facilitate or enable corruption. And you have seen loans, for instance, that have been approved that support agencies, entities that are owned by individuals that have engaged in corruption.
Well, I was going to answer one of the questions about the temporary worker program and the context, and it goes to what Adriana just said. We have to understand that people are leaving our countries not necessarily for economical reasons alone. Yes, they are poor, but if they had a much more secure space, if they know that their taxes are given back, if they have some glimmer of hope, they wouldn't flee Guatemala. Some of them might use this temporary worker program. I have observed in the case of Canada that also have a very big temporary program. The peasants and the people that access these programs are people that already have a much higher base of economical and security than those that immigrate or move toward United States illegally. Because the fact is that when people are very poor, they also live in the context of violence, and they are also the first ones where corruption plays an important role for the support or the assistance doesn't come, and that's where consultation go in. Consultation can help for many things. One, that the project is meaningful for the people that live in the area. When one of these Obama's projects came, the idea was to support communities where people were the biggest immigration groups were going out. But through the formal checked consultation process, the idea was building a road or a dam as a way to develop the communities. Of course, there was no development of the community, but the worst part of it is that those dam buildings or those roads supported the economical structures that are corrupt and that are linked to narco traffic. So what we have been saying is, and that's a big discussion with IMF and World Bank and IDB, is that corruption also happens in these big bills. Although the government of the United States might say, don't worry, we have all these big anti-corruption clauses. When we have kleptocratic government, the corruption happens at the same time that a company is listed, or several companies are listed as possible contractors. Already there, people have paid to be in that list. So the people that know who those corrupt structures are is the people locally and nationally. That's why consultation is so important, because it's not only the thing that it does arrive and does support what is needed, but also so it is worked through entrepreneurs are really entrepreneurs and not delinquents. But for me, companies that corrupt this high in Guatemala are not companies. They are another thing. They're a criminal structure. And the other thing that I wanted to address is that the pandemic is also a space where in countries as corrupt as ours is becoming a real problem, a big problem of corruption. So I just wanted to point out, Biden has just designated $2 billion for pandemic support for our countries. I think I don't know if it's just Guatemala or the Northern Triangle. So I'm always asking myself, in Guatemala, that it hasn't received a single vaccine. Even Honduras has received vaccine already. Where is this money going to go? And if we have vaccination, it's going to be free, or they're going to use this money, and we don't have any idea of this kind of things. And so just to announce and give this money without the structural reform, without addressing independence of judiciary, without addressing constitutional court, is kind of like throwing money away. So first of all, and as Adriana said, we need to change our governance structures. We need to kick out Juan Orlando Hernandez of Honduras presidency, and we need to make a campaign about Salvador. Nobody knows about El Salvador. It's kind of like Bukele, this crazy guy, but there's little knowledge of what really is happening in Salvador. Then again, we have the same problem. People do not understand what is happening in the Northern Triangle, so that's another role for you. Help people demystify that the only problem is economical.
So we only have a few minutes. I wanted to ask, Claudia, I wanted to ask you one specific question. And then I wanted to see if Adriana, you also had maybe a final remark. So Claudia, are there initiatives region-wide in Central America, consortiums of civil society or popular groups putting together these kinds of demands that that groups here could try to echo? Is there anything like across the region to create that kind of set of concrete demands? And then also Adriana, if you wanted to after give a final remark.
Well, as in the United States, we tend to be divided. There are countries more divided than others. Although our own failures in Guatemala, there is an important alliance and understanding between us. But that doesn't really necessarily happen in the region. What we have, and Adriana has one of these working groups that are trying to monitor and explain the situation on security. She already referred to the Central American report that is very valuable. It is still organization by organization, and we still don't have that transnational understanding. And I think that one of the mobilizers that we are having now, and we're trying to talk within the group, between the groups, within the countries, and then try to link to the other countries. And this is this regional initiative. We don't know what it is, of to disband, persecute criminal organizations, transnational criminal organizations, or these corrupt organizations within this country, like a successor to Machi and CICIG. But we are not there yet. So to work with our Guatemalan, Honduras, El Salvadorian countries, you will have to go. There are indigenous movements that try to work together. There's women movements that try to work together. There's children rights movements. There's an alliance on migration, on people in movement. I think that that's a very strong alliance. So it's like you guys over there, we guys over here, And I think that the idea is that we need to continue working together and try to build up this common understanding, so bring us together and not on individual interest.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Adriana, I don't know if you have any final words.
Yes, thank you. Just to say, and I guess sitting on my DC advocacy hat, because, you know, as these discussions on the immigration bills move forward, and I'm sure they're going to be taken apart, I do think we have a very important role to play here in DC, just to underscore the importance of focusing on the region and of addressing, you know, these drivers or root causes of migration. And to highlight something that Claudia said, and it's, you know, people are leaving because they have no alternative, and they've lost hope because of these challenges that Claudia and I discussed. So the importance of what role the US and the Biden administration can play in helping civil society, in helping, you know, very courageous, brave actors in country that are trying to address and, you know, we can dismantle these kleptocratic networks. And encourage, you know, everybody to, you know, there's a lot that can be done through the press, through outreach to your members of Congress, your senators, to really put these issues on the agenda.
Thank you so much. I will say that here in Southern Arizona, both of our congressional representatives, Ann Kirkpatrick and Raul Grijalva, are members of the Central America Caucus, chaired by Norma Torres, who's from Guatemala. So we have allies that we can work with here in Southern Arizona to support this. I want to thank both of our speakers for your insights and your experience and the incredible dedication that you both have and have had for many years. And also thank you everyone in the audience. I am putting my email in the chat for students who want to inquire about our Central America Studies program and our Mayan language fellowships. And so thank you all. This will be an ongoing conversation that we will continue to have here in Arizona. So thank you all so much.